Aubade Ludwig is coming to epicseven on June 11th, and honestly, this character looks way scarier than I think most people expected. He's a 5-star Ice Ranger, but he really doesn't feel like a normal Ranger in general, as this kit is built around souls, combat readiness push, control, and a massive AoE follow-up attack that scales all the way up to 25,000, yes, additional damage, depending on how many souls that he consumes. The craziest part about this, though, is that his artifact is also one of the most important parts of his release, as it's the first Ranger artifact that gives souls without any needing or any previous specific action necessary, like attacking, killing, dual attacking, or getting hit. So today we'll be going over how Ludwig works, why his damage is so crazy, what can actually answer him, what kind of teams that he'll fit into, and whether he actually looks worth playing. Now, like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed or learned something from today's video, and without further ado, let's get straight into it. Now, as we mentioned earlier, yes, the stats on this character is generally pretty fine, but this character actually has a lot that you should take into consideration that they've also mentioned. Yes, he is an Ice Ranger, however, he also has pretty high defense and effectiveness, which may leave you a bit confused about how he deals damage. That said, this is actually pretty interesting, as this means that he's not just a fragile damage dealer that needs to one-shot before dying. He's pretty tanky, and he does of course have a decent amount of effectiveness, which will be important later. That said, his kit, as we mentioned earlier, is based around getting souls, using these souls, and then turning them into extra damage through his S1, which we'll get into. That said, he does also get defense from his passive, which is why his defense is so high, and he also has a barrier on his S3, which we'll get into in a moment. Now, before we even get into the rest of his kit, it does appear right now that his playstyle doesn't seem very locked into one specific playstyle, as again, you can play him in something like a turn 2 draft, you can play him quickly, you can play him in aggressive, more fast drafts, and again, this is probably going to be a character that most people will try, especially using in things like Guild War and Arena, alongside RTA, of course. Now, I do want to mention the obvious, or address the obvious elephant in the room right now, which is that, of course, his kit is very soul-focused, and also, of course, this means that Bellion is going to counter him a decent amount. Now, I do think, of course, that if you are able to ban Bellion, Aubade Ludwig doesn't really look like he has a very clean or a clear direct counter, but let's actually break down his skills so that we can actually understand what makes him so strong. So starting with his skill 2, as I touched on earlier, this character gets free defense. Now, again, to be clear, this isn't really a character that scales with damage in general, so this is actually something that does end up being quite impactful, as otherwise Ludwig would be too squishy, he would die, etc, etc. Instead though, because of the fact that he has this built-in passive and his damage scales with souls, this is quite nice, because not only does this give him free stats, this also allows him to scale or pair alongside someone like Zio, who just for having souls allows Ludwig to push and take the turn afterwards. Now, I do also want to say, of course, this isn't the entirety of his kit, but just this alone makes him as a bruiser-ish character a lot more viable, and kind of why he's not locked into one specific playstyle. Now, as we move to skill 3, this is a pretty, honestly, disgusting ability. Now, to start things off, yes, this is a 100% chance dispel 2 buffs from all enemies, which is pretty nice. However, on top of this, there is an 85% chance to inflict block and silence for 2 turns block and 1 turn silence, which is already maybe the most ridiculous combo I've seen from honestly from a character's kit in one ability thus far. Now, I do also want to point out that there is a new set here that will allow you to increase this to 100, and whether or not you actually need Ludwig to be something in like the 320, the 330, like ridiculous speed ranges, honestly something crazy, and not even saying that most players can even hit 320, but if you were then able to, say, use the new set alongside this where you increase the effect chance here, this is a 100% chance to dispel 2 buffs, and also a 100% chance to inflict block and silence, which is obviously pretty insane here. Now, I do also want to point out the fact that this buff here, Dawn, is also pretty insane in of itself. This is an increase to the amount of souls that you acquire by 100%, and after attacking, you have a 25% chance to inflict stun on the target for 1 turn. Now, the stun here is just icing on the cake, and of course, this is a buff that Ludwig himself only applies, but being able to, again, stun targets with this buff on will come in handy, as his S1 is an AoE. Now, on top of this, you also have a soul burn effect here, which increases his barrier strength. And in case if you're curious if this is even necessary, you may find yourself in situations where maybe if you're building Ludwig super tanky, you may want to soul burn just in case if someone ends up picking a character like Celine to try and counter this. But overall, this is pretty insane and pretty impactful. Now let's actually move to his S1 though. Now his S1 is the bread and butter of why this is so insane. Now, normally and by itself, this will just attack one enemy. However, when Aubade Ludwig has Dawn, the buff that we talked about earlier, he activates this ability as an extra attack. Now, this is obviously where his damage is crazy. Light of Condemnation attacks all enemies and consumes your souls, even if the attack misses, and this will start with 1,000 additional damage, but it can scale up to 25,000 based on how many souls that you consume. So if he has enough souls, this is not just a small AoE follow-up, this is a nuke, and it's not particularly close. Now, to add to this though, the obvious, I guess, presentation, or the obvious maybe counter to something like this would be tagging something or trying to prevent the additional damage and take some of the additional damage characters to prevent this. But again, this still looks pretty difficult to deal with, as again, it's not an ability that has a cooldown. It's entirely tied to how many souls you have and how frequently you can generate souls, which we'll get into later. Now, again, this by itself, though, is already part of the reason why he is already good as a damage dealer, but when you add this on top of everything else, including the fact that, again, he has so many free stats, and it feels like he doesn't really have to build anything but tanky, it's clear that he is a pretty disgusting threat, at least for right now. Now, we should actually talk about his artifact, because this is another pretty insane addition or reveal with this update. Now, again, his artifact is pretty crazy. Now, to start, at the beginning of battle, this will give you 10 souls. Then at the end of your turn, it has an up to 100% chance to give 5 more souls, and this can activate up to 3 times. Now, the reason this matters so much is that this is the first ranger artifact that gives souls without needing the ranger to do anything specific. And again, this will then give you souls at the start of a fight and then gives you more at the end of turns. This is extremely important for Ludwig because his whole kit is much scarier when he has souls available to begin with. And this is, of course, on top of being able to pair someone like this alongside characters, or pair this with other characters that do need their soul burns at start of turn. If you end up taking some of these soul burn at start of battle, stacking artifacts all together, and it does also make him a bit more, I would say, a bit more useful or a bit more versatile in terms of setting up for a character like Festive Ida or Briarwitch Assyria or Lytica if you tend to go down that path. Now, I do also want to address the fact that, again, this also helps him activate his S2 push condition. It helps him fuel his soul burn, and again, it adds towards his S1 extra attack damage. But again, in general, I think if you're going to take Ludwig seriously and invest in him, his artifact looks very important, especially for him specifically. For builds, I think the most interesting part right now, again, is that he probably doesn't need to be built like a normal damage dealer. His base kit already gives him a pretty high amount of defense. He has extra defense from his S2, and then he has a barrier on S3. And because his damage comes from souls, you could probably build him, again, full tank or effectiveness without much needing or concern for anything else. Though, again, I think people will likely end up kind of bouncing between something like defense and HP, depending on what they are planning to play against. Now, again, I would, with this, basically expect most builds to focus on speed, bulk, and effectiveness. And again, his effectiveness does matter because his S3 is a strip, and does also have block, and it also has silence. Now, speed does also matter too, because you want him to take turns and cycle properly. And again, bulk matters because if he survives, he can continuously use his souls, CR push, control, and AoE follow-up. This is also why I don't necessarily think that characters like Celine, Salome, and Ruel are necessarily hard counters, though they can definitely be problems. It just kind of depends on the fight. Though I would definitely say that these are characters that may be a bit more challenging for someone like Ludwig to deal with, as again, Salome can copy him. Ruel can, again, revive. But again, these aren't even necessarily super hard counters, as there's things like blocks in place. There's things like tankiness or bulk in place, and it's a little bit more complicated than you think. However, again, if you are built tanky enough, if you have enough effectiveness, if you play around things a bit more carefully with Ludwig, I definitely think that this is a character that, even against these more difficult counters, or off the top of my head, difficult counters, are likely not going to be as effective against, or these characters won't be as effective against him. Now, in terms of teams and where he fits, Aubade Ludwig honestly looks like he can fit into basically any team. And they kind of showcase this, honestly, even from the video and the showcase here. This is like not really, as you can see here, this is not really like a super cleave heavy team. It's just got Sigrid and it's got Maid, I guess. Otherwise, it's a pretty tank or tank based team. I mean, geez, just made Chloe. In any case, though, that's one of the scariest things I think about Ludwig. Some units are like clearly made for cleave, some are clearly made for turn 2, but like Ludwig is obviously a character that could be fairly useful regardless of what you're using him against, which I think is honestly a pretty huge factor for Ludwig at the moment. In turn 2, again, you can build him super tanky, and again, he benefits a lot from longer games because the more turns that you have, the more chances he has to push himself forward and use his souls. And again, even in aggro, though, he also makes sense. Again, fast teams can generate lots of souls, take multiple turns, let Ludwig cut through his S2, and then once he has his Dawn and enough souls, his S1 can become, again, a huge AoE nuke. That said, I do think that this character by himself is also a character that puts a lot of pressure on the draft, and if Bellion is open, which, again, a lot of players do tend to ban characters like Bellion right now, especially with how strong characters like Freeman are, this is definitely one of the more flexible characters that you're seeing, or that you'll probably see, especially with the release or the changes or the upcoming season and all the different characters that are being released. Now, I do also think that even if you try to kill him early, you can definitely try to cleanse, or maybe revive him, which doesn't stop him, again, from then being able to follow up with the rest of his abilities, which honestly, just being able to use his S1 looks quite crazy here. This isn't even, mind you, as you're seeing on screen here, this isn't even a whole lot of souls that are being consumed here. And he just did 12,000 damage, which is like, what are we talking about? Like, honestly. But we should obviously talk about potential issues for him too. The first, I would say, is, of course, Bellion. If Bellion isn't banned, she can definitely mitigate a lot of the soul part of his kit. And that's a huge problem, even if you try to counter this by using his S3, disabling Bellion passive, etc. Aubade Ludwig, though, even without souls, is still a unit, though, with strip control and bulk. But he does lose a lot of the more threatening parts of his damage, which is pretty significant, I would say. It's not impossible because, all he does now is just fear all he does is just block and silence you and strip you. That's still pretty impactful, I've got to be honest. Now, again, other issues I definitely want to address, again, is the Ruel, Salome, and Celine. Ruel being able to bring back a key unit after he kills one, pretty scary. Salome can also self-cleanse with Sweet Miracle and maybe disrupt your combo, which is another pretty annoying character at the moment. But Celine is also maybe the more direct damage counter where, she can proc on the S3 and potentially one-shot the Ludwig himself, especially since Ludwig is water and she's grass. But again, these don't even feel like super truly hard counters in the same way that someone like Bellion does, who I think is likely going to be his best counter. Now, let's actually move to whether you should pull for Ludwig. Honestly, at the moment, if you care about PvP, this looks like a pretty hard character to ignore. His damage looks pretty insane. I mean, my god, it's 30,000 damage. Like, what are we as you'll see here from the end of the showcase, bit of a spoiler alert, it's pretty crazy. But again, even beyond just his damage, his artifact is very unique, and his kit has a lot more than just damage itself. He looks like he can fit into basically any PvP style, but the main question I'd probably ask is whether you need his artifact. This is mostly because, again, the artifact is additional pulls, and whether or not this is a character that you want to expend so many pulls on before Arnell is kind of difficult. Also, like, what was that? Like, can we just slow motion replay? Like, this is an absolute ridiculous amount of damage. But again, even aside from all the glazing and all the artifact stuff, this character, at least for the moment, looks pretty insane, even if we just pause on this, mostly because of his damage, but also because of just how versatile and how flexible he is. Again, with or without the artifact, and though I think the artifact is quite nice, as you do want to be able to continuously deal damage and also generate souls for upcoming or, you know, continued turns, this is still a character that I think, kind of similar to almost like maybe like a DN, isn't necessarily hard countered, even if you start to take characters like ML Aria or characters that necessarily stop or like would in theory quote unquote counter them. But again, at least for right now, there doesn't seem to be any super insane hard counters the way that maybe someone like maybe someone like a Bellion is for most of the mage characters, for now at least. Otherwise, again, I know I'm harping on Bellion and, well, like, oh, just pick Bellion if you want to counter Ludwig, but as I'm sure a lot of players have seen, if you take away some of the hardest counters in the game with a pre-ban, or you steal them, and then you pick the most OP character in the game, it kind of feels like there's no counters left, which, again, I will admit is something isolated or more isolated to RTA. And if you end up trying to use someone like Ludwig against Guild War or something like that, where they do have Bellion on defense, well, of course, this isn't going to work nearly as well. So in general, guys, I think this is likely going to be a character that most players will find value in. I think in general, this is almost feeling like a Nodos type, just clean sweep character. Like if he gets to use his abilities, well, like it is what it is. Even in the showcase that we've seen from earlier from epicseven, and though I don't necessarily think this is like a bad showcase at all, this is even like a showcase where he was kind of just by himself here, and he had to fight against a Scales team, and Scales, as you know, or as we all know, kind of mitigates or reduces the amount of damage that anyone does by like 1,000,000,000%, which is quite impactful. We'll have to wait and see if this is again enough to cut through some of the super tanky teams, but given again that you have a silence and a block, and really, I mean, what do you even do to counter that except like take 5 characters, I guess, that can't be debuffed? I don't even necessarily know what you can do against the character right now, though I think the most obvious answer is likely going to be, as usual, just outspeeding a character like this. Thanks again for watching though, guys. I think he's pretty cool. epicseven, you really cooked with this one. I'll see you on the next one though. Take care, stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.